show. I'm your host, Jon Stewart, captain of this dying medium. Why would you even say that to me? I had a gentleman tell me tonight. He said, oh, I'm so happy to be here. You know your television is dying. I said, I am aware, and in fact, I'm contributing to it. You're welcome.
How does Russia have a subway station that normal people use to get to work and home every single day that's nicer than anything in our country? There's no graffiti, there's no filth, there are no foul smells.
That's a nice subway. That's a very... Although, to be fair to the New York City system, it was constructed in 1904 out of urinal cakes by the great engineer Giuseppe Pissa Everywhere. But point taken, it's a very nice subway. But the subway, that's only one thing.
So we thought it would be interesting to take a look at a contemporary, modern-day, 2024 Russian grocery store.
Ooh. Go on.
All right. Here we go. So I guess you put in 10 rubles here, and you get it back when you put the cart back. So it's free, but there's an incentive to return it and not just bring it to your homeless encampment.
I know I've said this before. You're such a dick. Now, I didn't realize... Really, truly, like, a dick. I didn't realize America's homeless problem is caused entirely by easy access to grocery carts. I had all my stuff in my house, but I didn't know I could just put it on wheels. It's so much easier.
This is the grocery cart escalator. This is designed, I'm figuring this out now, where the wheels don't move, they lock on the grocery cart escalator. Look, Ma, no hands.
Okay, Forrest. An escalator for the grocery cart, and the doors open automatically. Oh, Mother Russia.
Russia is famous for its bread, which is one thing I can assess pretty well. Look at that. It's fresh, too. Look at that. Oh, come on.
This guy really likes bread. I hate to think what would have happened if he had found a bagel. But hey, if being a free speech warrior means you have to bang the occasional sourdough, Nostrovia. But our time is limited. Could you drive home the purpose of your deception on this trip in the most cynical way possible, please?
We didn't pay any attention to costs as we were just putting in the cart what we would actually eat over a week. And we all came in around $400, about $400. It was $104 US here. And coming to a Russian grocery store, the heart of evil, and seeing what things cost and how people live, it will radicalize you against our leaders. That's how I feel anyway, radicalized.
Radicalized. And it will radicalize you unless you understand basic economics. See, $104 for groceries sounds like a great bargain unless you realize Russians earn less than $200 a week. But that's the kind of context that a, what did you call yourself earlier? A journalist would have provided. But here's the reality. You f***ing know all this because you aren't as dumb as your face would have us believe. Perhaps if your handlers had allowed, you would have seen there is a hidden fee to your cheap groceries and orderly streets. Ask Alexei Navalny or any of his supporters.
In Vladimir Putin's Russia, political repression is everywhere. And hundreds have been arrested for daring to honor Navalny so publicly.
Right. Because the difference between our urinal-caked, chaotic subways and your candelabred, beautiful subways is the literal price of freedom. But the goal that Carlson and his ilk are pushing is that there's really no difference between our systems. In fact, theirs might be a little bit better. The question is, why? Why is Tucker doing this? Here's why. It's because the old civilizational battle was communism versus capitalism. That's what drove the world since World War II. Russia was the enemy then. But now they think the battle is woke versus unwoke. And in that fight, Putin is an ally to the right. He's their friend. Unfortunately, he is also a brutal and ruthless dictator. So now they have to make Americans a little more comfortable with that. I mean, liberty is nice, but have you seen Russia's shopping carts? And Tucker would have gotten away with it if it weren't for those meddling assassins.
In a statement to the New York Times, Carlson said, quote, "It is horrifying what happened to Navalny. The whole thing is barbaric and awful. No decent person would defend it."
Correct. No decent person would.
Let's kick things off with Nikki Haley. She made a big announcement today, but it wasn't the one we were all expecting.
Some of you, perhaps a few of you in the media, came here today to see if I'm dropping out of the race. Well, I'm not.
Okay, we'll just wait another week then. Do what you want, but it's not a good sign for your campaign if you have to keep announcing that you're not dropping out of the race. Nikki Haley's campaign has reached the guest who doesn't know when to leave the party stage. Republican voters are like, ooh, oh, God, I got to wake up early tomorrow. And Nikki's like, ooh, let's start a game of Risk. And if this speech was supposed to convince people that she should stay in the race, I'm not really sure it did.
We've all heard the calls for me to drop out. The argument is familiar. They say I haven't won a state, that my path to victory is slim. They point to the primary polls and say I'm only delaying the inevitable. Why keep fighting when the battle was apparently over after Iowa?
She's making a really good case against herself. They say my campaign is making everyone sad, that I'm a born loser whose own mother wouldn't vote for her. They claim I have a 14% on Rotten Tomatoes, and I'm not even a movie. Anyway, what were we talking about? Although, look, if Haley wants to stay in, it's her right. If her strategy is to just hope that Donald Trump goes to prison for life, she wouldn't be the only one. Game recognized game. Speaking of Donald Trump, it's been a week now since Russian dissident Alexei Navalny mysteriously died in prison after devoting his life to fighting Vladimir Putin's dictatorship. And Donald Trump honored him in the only way he knows how, by making it about himself.
The former president, for his part, weighed in yesterday evening. What he did was he shared an opinion piece on his social media website that compares President Biden with Vladimir Putin and compares himself with Alexei Navalny.
This is utterly disgusting, but I have to give Trump credit. I didn't realize he could make analogies. Look at that, he's got the double colons and everything. Like, little guy's ready for the SATs. But yes, it is unacceptable to compare Navalny with Trump. Navalny sacrificed his life for democracy. Donald Trump tried to sacrifice Mike Pence's life to kill democracy. You could not find two men who are further apart than these two. Now, if you're stupid enough to believe that Donald Trump is a courageous freedom fighter like Alexei Navalny, then good news. Trump has some perfume he'd like to sell you.
New Trump-branded cologne. It's called Trump 47, with the former president's head at the top of the bottle. According to the website selling the cologne, it smells of a crisp opening of citrus blends into a cedar heart underpinned by a rich base of leather and amber.
The last time Trump was underpinned by a rich base of leather and amber, Amber had to sign an NDA. the shape of that bottle. Is that cologne or a vibrator from hell? Now, if you think hawking perfume is undignified for the front runner for president, excuse me, don't worry, it's not just perfume.
Donald Trump introducing a new sneaker line at a shoe conference in Philly over the weekend.
This is a big crowd.
Appearing at SneakerCon in Philadelphia.
We're going to remember the young people, and we're going to remember SneakerCon. You're sneakerheads, right?
The former president took today to promote a money-making deal, having struck a naming rights agreement for a limited edition sneaker line. The most expensive pair in the series, selling for $399.
That's the real deal. That's the real deal.
This is actually the perfect shoe to tell the world you're about to lose a game of one-on-one by 50 points. To be fair, though, at least when you give money to Trump, you actually get something in return. If you give money to Democrats, all you get is 50,000 emails asking for more money. Send me a body spray, Nancy. But I don't know. Who am I to judge? I'm still wearing Crocs from the first time they were popular. But poor Donald Trump. This week alone, he was fined for $355 million. Historians voted him the worst president of all time. And Madam Web turned out to be too bad to even jerk off to. A real setback for him. So last night, Trump took his ego to the day spa, also known as Fox News, where he sat down with Laura Ingraham, who came cosplaying as a purse. She asked Trump one of the big questions on everyone's mind.
What qualities are you looking for in your vice presidential pick?
Well, always the first quality has to be somebody that you think will be a good president. A lot of people are talking about that gentleman right over there, Tim Scott. He has been much better for me than he was for himself. I watched his campaign, and he doesn't like talking about himself, but boy, does he talk about Trump.
I'm sure he talks about him to his therapist. God, that was so humiliating. Trump basically said you're only useful when you talk about how wonderful I am. And Tim just had to sit there and smile. I mean, who knew Trump also liked to grab him by the balls? So, okay, Donald Trump, tell us why he'd be a good vice president. And you make it even more humiliating.
The one thing that always surprises me is that the VP choice has absolutely no impact. It's whoever the president is. It just seems.
Always remember, Tim, no one cannot matter quite like you can't. Now get out there and show the world nothing. Now, one thing Trump did have going for him was that it seemed like Joe Biden would be going into the general election facing an impeachment over his son's business dealings. And if you've been watching Fox News, you would know that the case against Biden was a slam dunk, thanks to one of their GOP star witnesses. Just listen to Fox News anchor and human polo shirt, Jesse Waters.
The highly credible FBI informant says that the Burisma executive who allegedly bribed Joe Biden has audio recordings of Joe and of Hunter. One of the FBI's top informants, a guy with impeccable credentials, a great track record, the highly credible, multilingual, extremely trustworthy, longtime confidential FBI informant.
Wow. Highly credible, extremely trustworthy, multilingual, proficient at Excel, a good tipper, a generous lover, always puts the seat down. This guy is rock solid, bulletproof, impeachment case closed.
In a new court filing, federal prosecutors allege one of the FBI's own longtime informants spun bogus tales about President Biden and his son Hunter after meeting with Russian intelligence officials.
Alexander Smirnov was arrested Wednesday, charged with lying about financial ties between the president, his son Hunter, and the Ukrainian energy company Burisma, allegations that have been central to the Republicans' impeachment push.
Yeah. Not only was this guy lying about Joe Biden getting bribes, the FBI says that he was also working with Russian intelligence. Yeah, Russia again. Can we please just get a new storyline? Just once, I want to hear that, like, Bhutan is meddling in our election, just to mix things up. I mean, didn't we just find out that aliens are real? Maybe they want to get in on this, you know? So the impeachment case against Biden just took a big hit, although it wasn't that strong to begin with. I mean, it's like saying when Jimmy Carter entered hospice, he blew his chances of making the NBA. So now the prosecutors say this guy is a liar working with Russian intelligence. Surely Jesse, a responsible journalist, is taking it upon himself to apologize and make the necessary corrections.
Everyone who blows the whistle on the Biden syndicate or is connected to it has been arrested. What does that tell you? Joe Biden's a smooth operator. Informants, business partners, whistleblowers, they're all paying a price, but the Biden family has never paid a price. You got to hand it to the big guy. He's getting away with it.
That was an interesting way to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I personally would not have responded to this by accusing Biden of arresting his enemies. But hey, every news outlet has different standards. Some issue corrections. Jesse issues an all-caps Facebook comment. That's the beauty of free speech. You can say whatever you want out of your big, dumb mouth.
The idea that we have biological boys playing in girls' sports, it is the women's issue of our time.
Really, Nikki? That's the women's issue of our time? Not abortion access or equal pay or even how to part your hair so teens don't bully you? Never thought I'd say this, but Nikki Haley is so bad at knowing what women actually want, I think maybe her husband should order for her at restaurants. So most of her policies aren't more moderate than Trump, and if you ask her, she herself doesn't identify as a moderate.
On the campaign trail, Haley has made it very clear that she says she's not a moderate.
I have been a conservative fighter all my life. I was a Tea Party candidate when I became governor, and we passed one of the toughest illegal immigration laws in the country. We passed pro-life bills. We took on the unions, and we took on Obama when it came to the unions, the Syrian refugees, and everything in between.
Guys, she says she's not a moderate. Believe women. So again, if she doesn't say she's a moderate and her policies aren't moderate, why is everyone calling her a moderate? I guess it could be her demeanor. She's certainly the only candidate speaking at her moderate volume. And you got Trump screaming so loud, AT&T satellites are exploding. And then you got Biden at every press conference whispering to the ghost of Christmas past. Just using a proper inside voice is going to seem like a breath of fresh air. But that can't be all of it. When it comes down to it, there's only one real difference between Nikki Haley and Donald Trump that's getting her this label.
Do I think Joe Biden is the legitimate president? Yes.
Wow, what a reasonable, middle-of-the-road answer. The man who won the election won the election. But that's where we're at. That is the big split in the Republican Party today. Do you think Joe Biden won the election, or did you take a shit on Nancy Pelosi's desk? But the media is not used to discussing democracy versus fascism. They're used to discussing left versus right. So they put Donald Trump on the far right, and anybody who didn't storm the Capitol becomes a moderate. But that means that any Republican, no matter what their views are, gets labeled as a moderate just because they believe in democracy. Like Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. He's been called the most conservative governor in Georgia's history, but he also doesn't think the election was stolen, so now people call him a moderate. Or Liz Cheney, she denies climate change, she's anti-abortion, and she loves bombing other countries just as much as her dad. Yeah, she's a Nepo bomber. She loves bombing other countries so much, she thought Oppenheimer was the first season of an ABC sitcom. But because she says that Trump lost, guess what she's called?
You've got Liz Cheney being a female voice in the Republican Party, demanding a more moderate approach.
The thoughtful, moderate, pro-Constitution Republicans like Liz Cheney.
And you might be wondering, why does it even matter? So what if the media mistakenly calls some conservatives moderates? Sometimes I call my husband my ex-boyfriend's name. It's fine. He barely notices. He left me. But it does matter, because the word moderate means much more than just believing Joe Biden won the election. Most people still think that it means not extreme or willing to compromise. So when the media attaches this label to candidates who support abortion bans and endless wars, that makes those beliefs sound moderate, but they're not. And the media should not be labeling them as moderates just because they passed the low bar of not overthrowing the government. I'm sorry. I'm sorry if I'm getting emotional about this, but I just believe that having biological conservatives competing in moderate sports, that is the women's issue of our time.